Let's see. So we're going to talk about variables. As I mentioned, variables are found everywhere in games. Like, you kind of have to become really familiar with variables if you want to do anything more complicated than just like simple mazes or obstacle courses. We're going to use our first variable today. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what they are and how they're used. So variables are actually quite simple in nature. They're just something that holds some value. You guys have used them in algebra, right? Think back to like x equals 4 plus 7. What is x? It's 11, right? Or like 8 equals x plus 2. What is x? 6, right? So it's kind of like that idea where it represents a value, okay? And oftentimes it's a number. Sometimes it's more than a number, especially with regards to games. So I like to think of them a little bit like a USB drive, like kind of like the world's tiniest USB drive, though, because you can imagine if each of these USB drives is a variable and they're like super tiny, they can only really hold one thing at a time. That's kind of what variables are. And in a lot of cases, sometimes that thing that they're holding is different. Like you can write to a USB drive, right? You can also read from it. Let's say you put a text file on there, or like your homework, or some picture of a cat, or you have a Doge meme, or something. You put it on your USB drive. That thing holds that one picture. You can then copy it and read from it if you want to later. You can copy and paste it to any other computer. You can put it on all these computers if you want. These drives all can hold different things. Like here are two examples, right? Let's pick HP for one thing. If you played any RPG recently, you probably have some notion of like HP. The Final Fantasies have like, hey, I have 6,000 HP, or like Skyrims have like the concept of HP as well. If you get down to 1 HP in Skyrim, you can pause the game, eat like 300 potatoes, and then get up to full HP again. This thing is a number, right? So like, I have some number of HPs, hit points, and that's what this variable is currently holding. I can also hold something like your current level. Like, so Skyrim has something like level, right? This has, maybe you start off at 1, and as you level up, this number goes higher and higher. And if you ever want to know what level you are at, you just take this variable, which is represented by the USB drive, and you just grab that level from there. You just can like read that level from that USB drive. What's something about that isn't a number, like your name? Like you enter a name in a lot of RPGs or games, you type that in and it gets saved. And so later you can read that back. So maybe you show it to the player when he's interacting with NPCs. A lot of games do that, right? Like you enter something like Lonk for Legend of Zelda game, and like NPCs will refer to you by that name. Or if you really want to be clever, you can name yourself something obscene, and all the NPC characters will refer to you that way too. There are a bunch of other types of variables too. Like these are just examples. So let's just take a game like StarCraft 2. Let's try to identify some variables here that are currently being used in this screenshot. This is Scarlet versus Jadong. In case you guys aren't, anyone watch StarCraft 2 here? Anyone like StarCraft 2 fans? Only one? Oh, that's sad. Because StarCraft 2 is like a really great game to watch. It's like a really great like esport kind of game. I think it has a lot of merit to like the whole drinking beer while watching this. There's something called the bar craft you can go to. You guys ever heard of that? You go to like a bar, like we have one at Buffalo Wild Wings, and there's also something at. Does anyone here go to Beer Wednesday?
I go occasionally.
Sometimes. Yeah. Imagine that, but there's like games playing in the background, right? Which they don't really have at Beer Wednesday, unless they changed it recently. Okay. Anyway, let's talk about a few variables here. Can anyone name one variable that they see that could be used here? Anywhere here?
Resource counter.
Resource. Yep. That's like 383. I currently have 383 minerals. What did you say, Chauncey?
I was going to say just like the counters, but it's kind of the same as the resource.
Oh, these things? Yeah. Those are all variables. What are some other variables that are in this here that you can see?
The map? Does that count as a variable? Like
This
that
thing?
whole-
That's more like a collection of different variables, right? Like you can imagine each little dot here represents a variable. What about like the time? That's one.
Time.
There's the bar over the building there. I'm not sure if that's a health bar or a...
That's a progress bar, yeah. That represents progress can be a variable from 0 to 100, right? How complete is this thing? What about these here? Like what you currently have building, right? Also, each of these objects in the world has variables, right? Each of these drones, which are your workers, have HP. They also have variables to tell them what they're currently doing. Am I currently holding a resource in my mouth or not? Right? Am I moving or not? Each of these little buildings that are building have progress bars. So it's not just the fact that I'm building an overlord. It has a progress variable from 0 to 100 of how close it is to being done. Other things that are variables, like where is the camera right now? That's a variable. The camera is currently positioned over the hatchery. It's currently in the top left corner. There's a variable that stores where the camera is right now, right? You can also zoom in. There's another variable that stores how close you are to the world. There's also a variable like store you where your mouse is currently pointing to. I can't really see the mouse right now, but I just clicked over here. Okay. There's probably, if we went deeper, there's probably like 1,000 different variables that are just on this screenshot by themselves, right? So we're just going to talk about one today, which is the first variable I kind of want to introduce you guys to. But hopefully that makes sense. Like variables kind of make up a game. It stores the state of an object sometimes. Like it tells you what an object is doing, or it tells you like how much HP something has. It kind of stores information about things. That's why variables are useful. Like that's why these things are examples of variables, because they store different kinds of information. I have input up here. This is another kind of variable. So if I plug in a controller, if I have a controller in my hand, right, and I have the analog stick, and I'm moving that analog stick around, the direction that the analog stick is pointing can be stored into a variable. Right? If I'm pushing right on the analog stick, I can store that into a variable. What kind of variable is that? Well, what's nice about the analog stick is it's actually only two-dimensional movement, right? You can only move it left, right, up, down. There's like infinite degrees of freedom. You can move it all the way to the right or a little bit to the right, but you can't really like move it up or down. You can click it, but that's pretty much it. So it's a two-dimensional axis of movement, which means you can represent the movement of an analog stick with two numbers. One is how much to the left or right it is, and another one which is how much to the up and down it is. And by combining those two, you get movement. So when I push right on this, so I'm going to use a really simple example. Imagine that I can only hit right, left, up, or down. What I want to do is I want to take that input and I want to put it into a variable. So I push right, so I store that I'm pushing right. And then that makes Sonic run fast to the right. So Sonic is trying to figure out which direction to move by reading from that variable. So I pushed right on the controller, and then that set that variable. And then Sonic's like, oh, cool. I'm currently reading if you have any input. Before this, input had nothing inside of it. It had no arrow in it, right? So I push the button. Now it has an arrow. Now it tells Sonic, oh, he wants to move right. Same thing if I want to push left, right? I push left, goes into the variable. Now the variable has left and Sonic runs left, right? Kind of simple. Right? Does that make sense? Anyone have any questions so far on that? This is a one-dimensional input. Imagine you only had a controller that could go left and right. Okay, that's basically what that variable is. Now you can easily imagine that if I hit up or down, that variable will also hold up or down, right? I could actually have two variables, which is actually what ends up happening, is that I have a variable that shows me how much to the left and right I'm currently pushing, and then there's another variable that shows me how much to the top and bottom I'm moving. You can actually have a variable that's made up of smaller variables too. In this case, input is made up of left or right, but there's nothing that says I couldn't have an input that's made up of left and right and up and down. Here's an example of some of the variables that are in Playmaker. So this is the tab in Playmaker for variables. This is there's your state view, there's the events tab, which we used last week, and there's the variables tab. So here, this is what it looks like. You enter a name for your variable. You always give your variables a name like HP or level or input or name or progress or camera position, whatever you want your name to be, whatever information that thing is going to store. It's kind of like naming your USB drive. You put your name here, and then you get to pick what kind of information is going to live on there. Because that's the interesting thing about variables, is that they're really good at storing things, but they have to know what they're going to store ahead of time. So here's a list of some of the things that they can store. The top one here, which is a default, which is a float, it just means a number. And it specifically means a number, usually with decimal places, like it's a real number or a rational number. An integer means something that is just scalar values. It has no decimal places, so it can never represent like 3.14. It would always only be able to represent 3 or 4. It's whole numbers, not real numbers, right? So that's what an integer is. A bool represents whether something is true or false. That's it. It only has 2 possible states. Let's talk about a few examples of where these things would be used. Like a float. What are some variable types that you could use a float for?
On-screen instructions.
On-screen instructions? Like explain a little bit more. What do you mean? Like give me an example.
Push F to open.
Push F to open?
Something like that.
Well, a float here represents a number. Where does a number fit in that?
Well, only a number?
Only a number. It can only actually fit a number. So let me give you an example that might help a little bit. So a float here could represent something like your progress from 0 to 100. Right? Your progress can be 0 or 6 or 0.7. Right? So if we go back to the ScarCraft screenshot, progress here is actually a number from 0 to 100, but it's not really a whole number. It has little tiny fractions in it too. So that's a good example of something that I can represent with a float. Well, let's think about games that you're playing. What other things can you use a float for? It's kind of tricky, but
how far your level is.
Sure, your experience bar.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about something like critical hit chance in a game?
Yeah.
What's another thing that's like critical hit chance that could be represented with a float?
Dodge chance.
Dodge chance is a good one.
Life
Very
steal.
block.
Wait, what did it say? Something about life?
Life steal.
Life steal percentage, you heard? All that stuff is kind of percentages, right? It's not always 0 or 1. Sometimes you can have like a 0.5 crit chance, right? Or like a 0.5% chance to dodge. Not that it matters a lot. Like that 0.5 probably doesn't mean much in the long run, but it does matter. What are some other things? What about like with card games? Like think about a casino, right? Like what about the chance to draw something, like a king? That's probably like a percentage, right? So floats are really good at representing things like percentages. It's also really good for representing things like speed, like how fast you're moving, because sometimes depending on the units that you're using, it can be very big or very, very small. Like imagine I asked you guys to run as fast as you can from one end of the hall to the other. If I asked you to run and then put a radar gun to you and measured you in miles per hour, it might not be like that fast. It might be like, oh, I don't know, like the fastest guy runs what? Usain Bolt runs at like 27 miles an hour or something like that when he's running at his fastest. But that's a good example of something that can represent it. What if I measured you in something like light speed miles per hour? I don't know, like if I put you in C, maybe I'm going too far with that. I think you guys get the point, right? Float is a good way to represent numbers that involve decimals. What about an integer? That's what int stands for. What are some? What's that?
Whole numbers.
Whole numbers, yeah. What are some examples of variables in a game that can be represented with an integer?
Like members in your party. Or
Members in your party, that's good.
Because your
Yep.
inventory is not going to have like fractions typically.
No, yeah, that's a good point. Typically, HP is shown from like 0 to 100. You don't really have half a hit point. It's like maybe like Zelda. You might have like half
Yeah,
a heart.
like quarter hearts, half hearts.
Mm-hmm. Other things like, what about your level? We already showed that, like your current level. You're either level 1 or you're level 2. You can't really say you're level 1.7. Like you might be 70% of the way to level 2, but you're only level 1 still, right? That's a good example of an integer. Okay, let's do one.
Most of the time, like weapon damage and stuff will be a whole number.
Sure. Yeah, you'll pick a damage, something that does 7 to 10 damage. It'll either be 7 or 8, 9, or 10. It won't really be a fraction in between there, unless you want it to be. It's your choice. If you want it to be, you can use a float here. Okay. What about a bool? Something that represents true or false. What's that?
Does player have key?
Yes.
Which is what I was struggling with this week.
I'll give you another one. What if is the player alive or dead?
Okay.
That's a very easy. You're either alive or you're dead in your game, right? You're one of those two things. What are some other things in the games that are either true or false? Like think really big, like high level things.
Combat, out of combat?
In combat or out of combat, that's a very common thing in MMOs, right? In WoW, if you're in combat, you can't really mount, right? Or you can't really use some abilities. If you're out of combat, you're allowed to do some abilities. That's what bools are for. Any other examples of bools you can use in a game?
Is any true or false statements?
What's that, Mike?
Disability.
Like you mean like getting a debuff on you, like getting stunned?
Stealth, if visible.
Sure. Oh, visibility. Yep. Another thing: have I beaten the game or not? Right? Have I reached the end or not? Is the player on the ground or not? Right? You play any platformer. Usually, when you hit jump, you have to be on the ground in order for you to jump. It's kind of weird. If you play Super Mario Brothers, you can't double jump in Super Mario Brothers. You have to be on the ground to do that. So that's a bool that tells you whether you're on the ground or not. Right? Those are examples of bools. Okay, game object. This is something that's kind of specific to Unity. This variable is a little bit special. We are going to be using it a lot. This just really represents some object in your game. So it's not a number. It's not like true or false. It's actually representing another object. So it actually holds like it's actually pointing to another object, which means I can have a game object here. A good example of this is, hey, I want you to move to this other object, right? Maybe I have an enemy that's chasing me. And that enemy that's chasing me, I want to chase after the player. So the player could be put into a game object variable. A game object variable is just a way to store something else that's in your game. An actual physical thing that you can see or interact with. Okay. What about a string?
Oh, isn't that to hold like a string of variables, like certain ones? Or
This one is actually just a string of characters. So it's like a name is a good example of a string. What's some other examples of string variables?
Hello world.
Sure. What about game-related things that use strings? They're very, very common.
Hello, dwarf.
What about like I put names, but what are some other things regarding games that can use a string?
The names of items.
Yeah, names of items are a good one. Names of abilities is another one. Right? Usually a lot of names regarding that. Other things that use strings.
Conversation item choices.
Yeah, even a whole dialogue, like the actual entire, like all the things that an NPC could say could be stored in a string. Maybe have one string variable for everything that you can say. Right? It's pretty simple. Vector 2 and Vector 3 are basically the same thing. Vector 2 is kind of what I talked about before, where it allows you to store. It's basically made up of two integers. That's all it is. A Vector 2 is just two integers. It can be two floats too. It's just two numbers combined together into a single variable. That's all a Vector 2 is. So a Vector 2 actually represents typically x and y, which means if I have this screen here, here's some good examples of where a Vector 2 might make sense. A Vector 2 is just saying, usually is used for position. It tells me from left to right, this is x, and from top to bottom, that's y. And that's what Vector 2 can store. It can store an x and a y. So a good example here is that drone right here, this guy right here, he has a position on screen. How far is he from the left? Maybe he's like 20% of the way on the left. Let's just call this like 200 from the left, 200 screen pixels. And let's say he's about, I don't know, 600 from the top. So a good example of a Vector 2 in this case is that the Vector 2 would hold 200 in x and 600 in y. It's just two numbers combined to one another. It usually represents a position. Okay, that's almost always what it represents in a 2D game. So like you play any 2D game, and typically the player's position will be represented by a Vector 2. And then you have, right below it, a Vector 3, which is just for a 3D game. Typically, that's what you use a position for. So Vector 3s are also used for directionality. It actually represents things like velocity. You guys are familiar with the term velocity? It's like a physics term, right? Velocity is how fast you're moving through the world. And in a 2D game, you can only move in two directions, right? You can only move up and down and left and right. In a 3D game, you can move forward and backwards, left and right, and up and down. So there's 3 dimensions. And a Vector 3 can represent both where you are in the world as well as your velocity in the world. Let's say I catapulted you off. Let's say I'm playing this like siege game, and I throw a pig in the catapult, and I launch the pig in the air. Right? It has a velocity that's traveling through the air, right? It has a direction that it's going in the air. That direction that's going in the air can be represented by a vector 3. It represents how fast it's moving in 3D space. This might be a little confusing, but we're going to use it today, and hopefully it'll become a little bit more clear. All right, color should be pretty self-explanatory. A color variable represents what color something can be. A rectangle is just basically, it's a position, which is a vector 2, as well as a width and a height. We're probably not going to use this at all. Material and texture are both related to assets in Unity. Quaternion we probably will never use, but they're typically used for rotations. Most people spend, I don't know, you can spend a long time in the game industry. I've been in the industry for 10 years, and there's still things about quaternions that I don't understand. It basically represents a position, so it represents a rotation and an axis of rotation about which it rotates. But we're not going to really use that. It's meant to, you guys, if anyone here is familiar with the term gimbal lock, it's basically the problem that you have when you rotate an object fully 90 degrees up and you try to spin it around its axis. Sometimes it doesn't know which way to rotate and you get really weird problems. If you guys ever model something.
That's more for like when you're braking too, you have to be
Yeah.
careful with that.
So gimbal lock is a real thing in games too. That's why in any FPS, especially even in Overwatch, we actually never let you aim straight up 90 degrees. We let you aim 89.9 degrees up, so you can't actually aim straight up. Because as soon as you aim exactly 90 degrees up, now we don't know what axis to rotate you about when you turn. Let's say you aim all the way up and you swipe the mouse right. We don't necessarily know which way to rotate you. We don't know whether to roll the camera or spin the camera. That's why quaternions are used, because you can avoid that problem completely. Objects are anything in Unity that isn't represented by something in-game. So they're kind of similar to game object. We're probably never going to use this either. So I think it's probably just suffice to say that we're not going to use anything below rectangle probably. All right. Cool. So we are going to make a game today, and we're going to make a rolling ball game. Anyone familiar with the game Marble Madness or Super Monkey Ball? Super Monkey Ball? You guys have played that? Well, we're going to make a game like that today. And to make a game like this, we have to use a variable, which is scary, not really, but we'll get through it. All right, any questions about variables? So they're a way that you can store information, right? So we're going to do some of that. So I'm going to fire up Unity.